a bit later, good evening. Thanks for joining on time. We'll just give it a minute or so more. We suspect there's a few more people ready to join. So, but anyway, thank you for being on time. As I say, we'll just wait. I think there are 45 of you already. So I think we won't need to wait too long. So you have tuned into the right station. So thank you for doing that. The topic is about e-commerce at the border, is the title of a publication that we're launching. Today, we can send you the link if that's not already clear, and that's free to download and use and send to whoever you think that would be useful to share with. So again, don't hesitate. There's a question section if you want to know more about the report, how to access that. Do so, drop us a line. We can send you the report. So what is the report? Hopefully, you've already figured that the topic is about understanding customs duties and sales taxes in the context of e-commerce. So of course, those are big topics and there's a lot to be known about them. And there are many people who make their whole career in just that topic. So thankfully, we've got some people online with us today who, between us, there's a lot of expertise on understanding both the area of customs, how customs work and what that means for e-commerce merchants, but also sales taxes. Now, you'll have also understood that there was a particular context why we wanted to do this now. There are some changes that the EU has been working on to facilitate the collection of sales taxes, VAT, within the Union. So that does have consequences for small businesses, for them to understand that and to adjust what they do. So that's something that we'll be covering. So that's, the context of what we're doing. We think that we've got a couple of audiences here with us. Within the Ecom Connect program, what we're really trying to do is to reach out to small merchants who want to do e-commerce. And it's a growing community and it's a growing database of knowledge and expertise. So this is a contribution, this is an additional contribution to that. So we think among you now there are 60 or so attendees, and we're speaking with the voice of what the enterprises need to know about this topic, which is an area which causes a lot of stress to small enterprises who feel that they don't have enough information on how to handle this, with all the other things that they have to learn about the technology and how to price correctly. And pricing it correctly is understanding costs, and sometimes the issue of what duties to apply, what taxes to apply, and what to do with that can seem very mysterious, even though there are very good sources of information about that. And there are even other ways of handling it, such as using a logistics partner. And there we can come back to that, right? So let me just give you an overview of today's discussion. We'll start with a general discussion on duties and VAT in e-commerce. And here the background is a little bit choosing a couple of markets which seem to come up when we're working with small businesses from developing countries. Very often the key market they're looking at is either the US, being obviously a very developed market for e-commerce, or Europe, sometimes other locations. But this was what we were working on to make this advice very specific, what you need to do. So Famke will give us this introduction. What is this topic? Why is it important? What to do? And then we're lucky enough to have Annegret Roloff, who's policy officer at the European Commission in the area of taxation and customs duties. And so Annegret will explain to us this context about what's changing, particularly in the European Union, and particularly in the area of VAT. So that's the context. And we thought that would be good to have the voice as well of our partner who's taken part in other events with us, Estonia. So that's where we've got the input from Ulan, who's in the business development team in the e-residency. We've spoken about e-residency before. It does have some relevance to this. I'm sure if you want to know more about that, we can also connect you about what's going on about e-residency. And we had hopes about marketplaces. We didn't have a speaker directly on marketplaces. I think they're very busy, the ones that we spoke to. They're very busy making this change happen right now. So unfortunately, even to the last moment, we were hoping to have somebody official from a marketplace. We have had an offer to come back on another occasion and do this. So we'll hold that. One of the big ones, beginning with A, and it's not Alibaba, would want to come back and give us their view. So that's something to look forward to. So, and last but definitely not least, is the implications in respect of logistics. And there, Stephen Pope, we're lucky to have, who heads up an initiative within DHL, the Deutsche Post DHL group, called GoTrade. So Stephen will make that connection about, from his background as well, a long background in understanding customs and duties and in the context of the work that his team is doing to try and develop trade in this context through e-commerce. So, okay, I will stop there. It's a general introduction, and it's with great pleasure I can hand over to Famke. Famke.
Thank you, James. Let me make sure that I have the correct presentation to screen. This seems the case. Right. Thank you for the introduction, James. I'm really pleased to be here today. I mean, we've been working over the past 2 years, I think, on a publication toward customs duties and taxes and trade compliance more in general in an e-commerce context, and that really responded to a demand from our constituency, or your constituency at the ITC in developing countries, where there was increasing potential to scale up e-commerce and sell in different markets of the world. So I'm really happy that we finally managed to conclude this publication. It's really exciting. A little bit about myself. I'm Famke Schaap. I'm based in Brussels as an independent trade expert. I have spent 3 years working with the International Trade Center in Geneva at the Business and Trade Policy Desk, and then also spent 3-4 years with Deloitte Belgium on global trade. But now as independent, I'm quite excited to be able to work with bigger companies, but also the micro and SMEs, because I think that perspective is increasingly relevant, and it's important also to recognize that the perspective or the opportunities, but also the challenges in trading globally and exporting products across borders. Those challenges are definitely not faced in a similar way between small business and bigger business. So why did this publication come about? I already mentioned a bit of that background, the increasing opportunities that are offered for small, medium-sized companies to sell virtually to any client across the world, especially facilitated through global platforms, e-commerce platforms, but also through very growing role of customs brokers and logistic service providers that actually help small business to cope with the challenges that otherwise would be unsurmountable. At the same time, there are definitely these issues such as lack of predictability and changing legislations. And also there are growing expectations from customers to know upfront what will be the customs duties and VAT costs that are linked to my purchase. This is really an issue for e-commerce sellers, that they don't always know how to respond or even how to calculate. So the publication is quite practical in that sense. It gives a perspective on how customs duties and taxes work in an e-commerce context. and also it sheds light on some of the market-specific, the contexts, market-specific context in the US and the EU, because those changes that are ahead or have also appeared even this year, and we will hear more about that in the EU, the VAT e-commerce package, for example, they really implicate small business. So I'll have a presentation, but here's a short recap indeed. So customs and taxes impact directly upon pricing. A lot of consumers nowadays, increasingly consumers expect free shipping, for example, in e-commerce. And well, as a seller, if you actually you can't go beyond customs duties and taxes. So if free shipping is expected, does that include or does that not include the customs and taxes? But of course, when customs compliance is not met and there are issues at the border, it also directly impacts upon reputation of a business. And in the digital context, reviews are so important. So trade compliance is definitely a component of that. Delivery models, they're really crucial, and I think that's interesting in the guide that you will find out that there are different choices for e-commerce sellers, right, to sell from your home country into a foreign market, and to do trade compliance in-house, do it all yourself, or either work with a customs broker and outsource some of these responsibilities. Obviously, that comes at a cost, but also at an advantage that you will have don't have the burden of taking care of that yourself. The option warehouse, for example, in the target market, close to the consumer, including with fulfillment services, and I think that increasingly becomes interesting, also to be really close to the consumer. And of course, these different delivery models have different implications for trade compliance and for customs and taxes. So that's definitely something to keep an eye on. A final point to mention, customs duties still matter. I mean, there's a general tendency that duties have come down. That's definitely true. However, when you look, for example, on the right side, you see that customs duties still take up almost half of the total cost in some of the countries, but VAT also is growing in importance and perhaps increasingly used by governments as a tool to perhaps, well, we'll see for what purposes. But both issues can be seen as, tariffs and non-tariff barriers are definitely part of trade compliance. Obviously, with returns, that is also a growing complexity for business. Just to mention here that indeed it shows trade compliance, it's what does it actually include? So it's customs and VAT, but also other non-tariff measures such as standards and quality issues. They can be faced either in the departure or in the arrival country. So as a small business, you actually need to keep track of all your target markets, different requirements, and also make sure that you comply in your home market. That seems a very challenging task, and thankfully there are increasing tools and support services available and information provided by the government, obviously. Just to emphasize, trade compliance is actually in an e-commerce context not that different. The issues are largely the same: customs registration, duties to be paid, but there are some e-commerce specifics such as low value goods thresholds, like you can have access to sometimes reduced duties or taxes, and sometimes also easier paperwork. But frankly, the differences are not that big, if you ask me. I don't want to spend too long on this slide, but it's just to raise a bit of attention for the customs process. A lot of businesses they don't have full insights in how actually the export process happens and what is the role of the customs administrations. Also, what is the role of the broker, and when and where can he or she support you? And then obviously your obligations as a seller perhaps some of you also, the Incoterms, they're obviously very important, where either as a seller you take full responsibility for the delivery and the customs and duties costs, or you put part of that responsibility on the buyer. So those issues can be categorized at before the border, at the border, and also after the border. I think it's not to be forgotten that returns, they cause another trade compliance headache sometimes when you have to go through the process again if your consumer returns the goods. Oops. Yep. Here. Yeah, just here, the perspective of understanding what government faces in the current developments of growing e-commerce trade flows. I think it's really relevant because it provides the context of why there are shifting and changing legislative frameworks on taxes and duties and new e-commerce registration requirements. I think it's really important for sellers to understand that obviously customs duties and taxes, they are an important source of revenue. And if e-commerce small packages, they grow in importance and in volumes, but they actually do not contribute to the government revenue, that's an issue. And there's in the EU certainly this worry, and one of the driving forces for the new legislation. At the same time, illicit trade flows are also a concern when e-commerce sellers are actually invisible to our customs administrations. They didn't have much information about the actual seller. So that's also one of the reasons for example, ask registration. So this is my conclusion here, just because in this panel debate, we also discussed the new legislation. So some advice for governments to take into account the micro and SME perspective to ensure information and transparency, because SMEs have limited know-how and often are really behind in their understanding. So it's so important to have this access to information, and not in a complex way, but really to make it digestible for let's say, well, I don't want to say red dummies, but it's important to have this also simplified information on specific market requirements. Increasingly, companies use software and automated tools to support their trade compliance, but typically they're really expensive and not available for SMEs. So that would definitely also be something if governments could perhaps support those developments, even through collaboration with customs brokers and platforms. And finally, communication. I mean, help desks are very important and very useful, not only at the logistics services and platforms, but even at the government side. Thank you. I hope this is useful, and that the guide may serve a purpose and answer questions.
Okay. Thank you, Frank. Dummies, I don't think there's any shame in pretending to be a dummy. As I said, a lot of people there are some people who spend their whole career in this, so there's a great deal of expertise that's necessary, and there's a topic that changes. So the business about being an entrepreneur is not necessarily to be an expert in this, and thankfully there are a lot of people who can help you. And I should also mention that there are a number of tools out there, not least of which ITC's market information tools, which help to understand market access conditions. Again, you can find that if you go to our website, intrasend.org, and you can find under market analysis tools that there's a lot of information there. And you'll also find some tips and tricks how to use that in the publication. So, okay, and with that, I'm very happy to pass to Annegret Roloff. Annegret.
Hello and good morning, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank ITC for inviting the Commission and to give me the occasion to present the major initiative in VAT in the EU for, I think, the last 25 years. My name is Annegret Roloff, and I work at DG Taxud, which is the main tax and customs authority of the European Commission. Yeah, tomorrow we will have one of the major reforms in e-commerce, and you might have heard about this because it will really change the VAT system. Here on this slide, you see the aspects, the main reasons for changing the legislation. First of all, it was about fairer taxation, and this was already mentioned by Femke, to treat, let's say, businesses in the EU the same way as businesses outside of the EU. The second objective is to get a more simplified process, make it easier for small and medium-sized enterprises to pay and collect VAT. Also to create a bigger, better price transparency, and also a greater VAT compliance. Next slide, please. Here you see, in a nutshell, what will be new from tomorrow onwards. And let's say the major change is that the current 22 euro VAT exemption for B2C shipments will be abolished. That means that all goods imported to the EU will be subject to VAT from the first euro cent. For this, in order to facilitate this major change, the EU has created one mechanism, and also a backup mechanism for B2C consignments to collect the VAT. And this is the Import One-Stop Shop, IOSS. It is not mandatory. That's the first thing. And for those businesses who will not use it or cannot use it, there's also some kind of a special arrangement. And I will explain these two mechanisms in the following, let's say, 10 minutes or so. I will also mention that there's also an impact on the customs procedures with this reform. First of all, the electronic customs declaration will now become mandatory, and there will be a new so-called super reduced data set. But I will first start with the Import One-Stop Shop. Next slide. So the IOSS is an IT system that allows sellers to collect, declare, and pay the VAT to the tax authorities instead of making the buyer pay the VAT at the moment the goods are imported into the EU. Because actually this will happen, and this would also happen today for all the goods that were more expensive than 22 euros, that, let's say, the consumer would have to pay it. And it is, let's say, very burdensome and also not so much appreciated by the consumers. Me as a consumer, I like to do online shopping, but I want to see what I pay. I want to see the price at checkout. And exactly this solution, IOSS, is about this kind of experience. So I will explain a little bit which sales are covered. All sales from outside the EU in consignments with a value not exceeding 150 euro. Why 150 euro? Because this is the customs threshold. I will explain the customs implications later onwards. And all goods that are not subject to excise duties, usually alcohol and tobacco products. So the idea is that businesses register in the IOSS, and it is a European system, but each EU member state has an online portal where businesses can register. However, there's a big caveat. The business needs to be based in the EU to be registered in this Import One-Stop Shop. If a business is not established, then there are two options. Either the seller can, if the seller sells its good via one of the marketplaces, then he or she should check with the marketplace whether they have registered in the IOSS. And if they are, then the platform or marketplace would then collect and pay the VAT. And if the goods are not sold over a platform or a marketplace, then this business would have to appoint an EU established intermediary to fulfill the VAT obligations. Of course, now you ask, where is the intermediary? How can I find them? And I can send a list to James about the contact details of the member states, because you would have to contact the member states authorities and they would be able to help you with that. Okay. Okay, a quick snapshot of what, if you would be interested in joining, what would you have to do? The first step, of course, is the registration in the IOSS. And with that registration, you would get an identifier, your VAT IOSS number, which would then be important, and you would use it throughout the process to be identified as a company, registered and able to, let's say, pay the duties upfront. You would have to charge the VAT. And this would mean that you would charges upon the checkout of your online web shop at the moment of sale. You would have to declare and pay VAT to the tax authorities in the member state where you are registered. And this would be done on a monthly basis. You would have to keep the records of the IOSS sales for 10 years. And last but not least, why are we doing this? The goods, when they cross the border, they are VAT exempt, because the VAT has already been paid upon the moment of the sale. Next slide. So in the end, as I said, this is a model that is really consumer friendly, because the consumer would then wait at the door and get the consignment, and everything would be, without any bureaucracy, and you would pay the payment at the end of the month. For companies that do not register in the IOSS, there is also a fallback procedure, which is called the special arrangement for VAT, which is the option if the IOSS is not used. And in this case, postal operators and express couriers will collect the VAT from the consumer and also pay it on a monthly basis to customs. In the end, they pay only the VAT effectively collected. This is also valid for goods not exceeding 150 euro and not subject to excise duties. But in this case, the postal operator can only do this arrangement for if it is the member state of final destination of the goods. Just one word for goods over 150 euros and that are subject to excise duties. There will be, let's say, the current procedure. It will be also the consumer paying the price. There is no change so far. Then please, the next slide. At the end of my presentation, I will talk about the impact on the customs procedures. Next slide, please. There is a customs de minimis threshold of 150 euro that will be not affected by this reform. And you see that the IOSS only covers shipments below 150 euros. So that means those are not subject to any customs duties. However, there is also a new requirement for all customs, for all shipments from the first euro cent. There is the obligation to lodge an electronic customs declaration. So in the special arrangement, then this would be done by the postal operator express courier. For the in the end, but there's a small simplification. as these consignments are not subject to customs duties, there is a super reduced data set for the low value consignments. And this is more or less the same data set as the CN23, the customs declaration for postal consignments. So this is it, more or less. This is an overview. Of course, there's much more to this subject, and I have a number of publications and websites that you can consult when you are interested. The first one is the EU site, and here you find really information for all kinds of businesses. You find information for sellers, for marketplaces, for postal operators, and so on. Yeah, that's it. And I'm very happy to answer your questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, Annegret, thank you. That was very clear. So, you know, and very helpful to have things structured in that manner. There are a couple of questions, but I think probably we keep the flow going at this moment and pass to the next speaker. Perhaps we can come back and have a little discussion if you'll stay with us. Thanks. So with that, I have pleasure in turning to Ulan, who actually you're in our time zone, aren't you? You told me you're in Berlin, but
I am.
But is normally in Estonia. So Ulan, welcome.
Well, thank you, James, for inviting me to this event. I've had a very interesting time listening to Annegret and Famke. I have a more, how to say, bird's eye view on this topic, and maybe a short intro to where I'm coming from. I work for the Estonian government and for its e-residency program. It's the first one in the world giving non-residents from all countries the opportunity to get a secure digital identity and use it to register a company within the EU, so namely in Estonia. So we work with entrepreneurs, typically SMEs from all around the world, but also a lot of solopreneurs. Those entrepreneurs usually are in one way or the other in the digital sphere. So typically they would provide digital services, which has already been subject to this mini one-stop shop for quite some time. But also increasingly they are dealing with physical goods and in the e-commerce and drop shipping sectors. And because we work with a lot of non-resident entrepreneurs, we also work with a lot of accounting and tax consultants from the private sector who serve both Estonian-owned companies here in Estonia and also e-resident company owners. And since I started working for the e-residency program last year, then I have just kept hearing about how this change with the OSS is going to make things easier, and positive comments from these accounting partners and tax consulting partners of ours. So everybody's hoping that this actually makes the life of an e-commerce business owner easier. I guess we don't know exactly what's happening tomorrow, but this is at least the attitude that everybody has. And Estonia as a country is also hoping that this will become one of the reasons why more e-commerce trade would be coming through Estonia, because as you can imagine, a country of 1.3 million people otherwise is not an attractive consumer market for anybody selling anything to the EU from the outside. So looking from the outside, we are tiny, and when thinking of Europe as a market for e-commerce, you're thinking of Germany, you're thinking of France, you're thinking of Spain and Italy. So definitely not Estonia. So looking at this one-stop shop scheme from inside EU, is mainly visible that this is the simplification that a lot of businesses have been waiting for, and making the process more hassle-free and less bureaucratic. After all, it's the EU single market, right? So I'm actually surprised that it hasn't happened earlier. And I really agree with what Famke was saying, that it should even be simplified further, especially keeping in mind that the businesses are quite small who have to keep compliant in this sphere. And like Annegret explained, then looking at it from the point of view of EU-based online seller, then we've had two problems, right? Like each country has a very different threshold for VAT registration. Each country has a different process for VAT number. It might take in some countries weeks, in some countries even a month. In Estonia, for example, it takes maximum 5 work days. So it really varies from country to country. And this has been quite a hassle even for EU sellers, keeping an eye on where do I exceed a certain threshold, where do I have to register. So it's a reason why a lot of services from private sector side have actually popped up to solve these problems, like different SaaS softwares to keep an eye on those thresholds. And the other problem is that the packages arriving from outside EU have this VAT exemption of 22 euros. So looking at it from the EU, you're thinking, okay, like it's kind of an unfair competition that certain small packages enter the EU without having to pay any VAT. And there are millions of packages entering EU every year like that. And it's for an EU seller really hard to compete with prices. So coming from an EU perspective, the changes are positive, because now you can just basically declare your taxes and pay your taxes to just one country having one VAT number. Obviously, when you are already an experienced seller and you have gone through all this trouble of registering for VAT in various markets where you have your customers, then that process is already done. You've spent your time and energy on it. So that effort's been made, but the later administration can still be made easier by joining this OSS scheme in one country. And I would like to hope personally that this actually this change puts EU in a better place as a target market for e-commerce sellers from the outside, because compared to the US is the largest consumer market and has a very established e-commerce sector. People are used to buying online, ordering everything online. And coming from anywhere else, where would I want to expand my business? To the US with one uniform language and culture, or to EU with a bunch of different countries, different legislations and different VAT thresholds? Like it seems like it's quite scary. So I would like to think that it actually puts EU in a better place as a target market for a lot of sellers from the outside. And as for the second issue, since this 22 euro exemption is going to be abolished, then it also reduces competition with very, very cheap suppliers who don't have to pay VAT. It might discourage certain sellers from even dealing with European consumers, either because they will lose this price advantage, or just because their administrative and compliance burden will actually increase now that they have to start declaring from first euro cent. But in Estonia, receiving packages as private individuals and declaring them through customs has been online since forever. So what you said, that all countries are required to have an online customs declaration, then we've had this for a very long time. And since Estonia has provided this e-residency program for 6 years, it is a way to tap into the EU single market from elsewhere. So when entrepreneurs get e-residency, then they are able to register a business inside the EU and manage it completely online, thanks to the fact that Estonia is so digital. So the simplified tax declaration actually is accessible through this Estonian company registration and becoming an Estonian entity to also sellers from other countries outside of the EU. And it may pose lower costs, even having an Estonian entity, than finding this intermediary to help you with your IOSS registration and doing these tax declarations for you. So while this VAT registration used to be dependent on where your customers were located, then obviously you would look into the compliance of the biggest markets like Germany, Italy, France. And now I believe this puts countries with the most digitally accessible and flexible jurisdictions into a better place for sellers from outside of the EU. But this, as James's organization is really about supporting very small companies and very small sellers, then it is still like a fine balance between whether whether having a company in the EU makes sense for somebody whose operations and revenues are quite small, because once you register in a different country, it still poses certain obligations. You still have to declare your activities in this country. So it's a decision whether a small family business will actually find this a good option or not. But it is one of the choices that allows third country sellers to be part of the EU single market in a quite easy way. And since we have been declaring our taxes since 2000, completely online on both the private individual level and company level, then we are used to serving non-resident company owners. All the government systems are accessible in Estonian, Russian, and English. And I've looked into a little bit what the other countries are doing and how they are approaching this OSS topic, and it's not the case everywhere. In a lot of countries, you can only access it in the local language, and this is a big problem for somebody from the outside. And while it's looking all quite new, and businesses are like excited and waiting to see what is actually going to happen tomorrow, then I have a good feeling, at least, about our country. Our tax board and customs board has been running Q&A sessions, online seminars already since March, introducing the new system. So yeah, we are ready to go from tomorrow. So that's the short summary of our perspective.
Well done, thank you. Well, that's great. So positive, forward-looking opportunities for Estonia. There were a couple of things that maybe picked up by our audience of small entrepreneurs, that e-residency is an opportunity. We've spoken about it before. We can answer questions on it again and have another look at it. And it may be interesting to do something very focused on this question. A resident representative, or an e-residency, what makes sense and for who. That might be interesting to have a little cheat sheet on that. I think everybody's admiring the sweatshirt. I don't think that's something that you're making available, but well done. Branding is important. So thanks, great. So then we can pass, as I say, last but not least, to Stephen from DHL. Ready for tomorrow would be my question. So tomorrow is a great new thing. Stephen.
Yeah, thanks, James. Just to put it into context where I'm coming from, firstly, thank you very much, James, and thanks to ITC for the invitation. As James Wilson knows, as some of you already know, I used to work in DHL Express. I no longer work for DHL Express. I'm in the corporate headquarters now, and I'm head of our trade facilitation department. So my world has moved from expedited clearance and express delivery to the world of trade facilitation, micro, small, and medium enterprises, and the key for us is developed and least developed economies. We took a conscious decision within the company to engage in the trade facilitation debate and actually turn our global footprint and our expertise in logistics into actions, working together with partners like ITC and some EU countries as well, donor countries, on empowering SMEs and enabling them to access global markets from developed and least developed economies. And what we are doing is we're teaching SMEs what they need to know and what they need to comply with in order to access those global markets. They don't necessarily have to ship with us. This is clear. This is not a commercial enterprise that we're involved in. This is about part of our corporate sustainability agenda. And what we're calling it is basically creating global, sustainable and inclusive economic growth through trade. One of the challenges that we've seen, and I think governments have seen over the years, has been the move from traditional trade into e-commerce. E-commerce is not a change per se. It's a paradigm shift in commerce. It's what it is. So what we've done is we moved away from the world of bulk shipments in trucks and containers to individual shipments being sent. And for the customs environment, that has been a real challenge when you look at how customs operates. It operates on a transactional basis. So in the days of containers and trucks, that was quite easy to deal with. You had one container turn up, you had probably one declaration. Now, that container would have held about 10,000 individual items. Today with e-commerce, what you have is 10,000 separate declarations coming into customs, and customs needed to adapt to that. And as Annegret has pointed out as well, and Famke mentioned as well, the challenge has been around the taxation of e-commerce, particularly around consumption taxes such as VAT, and in Australia they call it GST as well. And of course, governments are looking for revenues. They're looking at covering revenue leakage, and I think in this current situation, it's not surprising. And we do need a level playing field. We do need fairness, and that has been part of the debate. I think there's one area that I would add to that is, in terms of fairness, we need to make sure that there isn't discrimination between domestic and non-domestic retailers in terms of the process. What we're talking about when we look around the world at de minimis limits for duties, customs duties, the EU, it's 150 euros. In the US, it's $800. In Australia, it's 1,000 Australian dollars. So what we're looking at is how you collect that tax in a way that minimizes the burden on the individual and makes it as cost effective as possible. And of course, with that in mind as well, our big focus is on the trade facilitation agreement and the need within the trade facilitation agreement for countries to remove or minimize and reduce as a priority red tape. In other words, the bureaucracy that's needed. And I think that the challenge for us has been at the moment is looking at this. The first country that really jumped in this area was Australia. They were involved in a long debate on the taxation of e-commerce, looking at not only the impact internationally, but on their domestic market as well. And they came up with a model which minimized the impact on receipts. And so what Australia have done is they've maintained an absolute level playing field between domestic and non-domestic retailers, i.e. the turnover threshold for overseas shippers is exactly the same as it is for domestic retailers. They've kept the 1,000 Australian dollars de minimis limit, which some would argue is rather high. But they've done that to minimize the impact on customs resources, which of course are limited and need to focus on areas which are important to that national government. And so what they've done is they introduced a simple way for countries to register and to pay the tax overseas. You don't need to be a resident in Australia. You could register it on the website. You can transmit payments. You can pay by monthly, quarterly, or even annually. But obviously you have to meet certain criteria to meet those circumstances. So what we've seen with the simplified model that the Australians have had is that what's happened is that they've had an above expectation number of registrations because it's so easy. In the postal stream, which was outside of the original basically policy of Australia, what they've seen is postal shipments. Companies are finding it so easily that they're actually declaring and paying VAT within the system. In fact, the Australian government recently announced that they are running at 300% above forecasts in terms of revenue take. Now, tomorrow the EU is introducing new legislation on e-commerce, which is clearly understandable given the issues that they were facing in terms of revenue loss. But what we need to look at is the challenge that we currently have is that the EU regulations are out there, the guidance is out there, but then you need to drill down to the member states. We've heard from Elena, and I think Estonia is not just a key example for the EU. Estonia, in terms of digitalization and simplification, is probably the window on the world. I think I mentioned earlier on to Elena before the start of this, 10 years ago, the UK government were looking at what Estonia was doing with flat taxes and digitalization. They're light years ahead of many countries around the world. And that's to be applauded. The caution that we have is at the moment for tomorrow, we have a major challenge, and that is a challenge for SMEs wanting to export to the EU, is there is no transition period. So tomorrow at midnight tonight, the rules will change. So 1 second after, the rules change. So even if you sent something last week or even yesterday, and it arrives after midnight tomorrow, the new rules will apply. What we're seeing is that many member states have still not implemented the IT. One EU member state still doesn't have the legislation in place. So We're issuing a lot of guidance. I think the advantage is, as Elena mentioned, you can register in one place. So that will help you if you're trying to export to another country and they haven't implemented the IT yet. But the challenge is how we communicate that. And I think one of the key things is what would be helpful, I think, for SMEs and would be helpful for us is a website which actually lists every single member state and where they are on the OSS implementation, what their current position is, and what their timetable is. I think, Elena, you mentioned, it could take days, it could take months. We don't really know. So we're doing all that we can. DHL has issued a lot of material on site, but I think the key thing is we do need a lot more transparency in terms of what member state is doing from midnight tonight. We know that some member states have already told us the fallback is a full customs declaration, and that is a concern. For solving the intra-EU challenge on VAT, on what they used to call the distance selling rules, this has been an absolute main game changer. And for EU businesses, for SMEs, it will reduce their burden. I think the EU have said by 95%, and that's to be applauded. For non-EU SMEs, it's a bit more of a challenge. For example, the Belgian Post, for example, have issued a statement saying, if you haven't registered for OSS, and you ship to the EU, they will charge you 15 euros to collect as little as €2.10. And that's actually on their website. So they're charging you 7 times the amount of tax that's going to be collected. So I think, we need to look at where we are tomorrow. The justification for what's been implemented is absolutely clear. Everyone around the world has understood that's a challenge in terms of taxation of e-commerce. There needs to be a level playing field, but I do think we need to look at simplifications. We must be mindful of the trade facilitation agreement, and we must, within developed economies, have a mind on the fact that we are still in the COVID-19 pandemic. The World Bank has just said that we will probably see the biggest bounce back economically from a recession that we've seen in 80 years, but only in developed economies. And the least developed and developing economies stand to fall back further. And so what we need to do is we need to focus on how do we facilitate legitimate trade in developed and least developed economies. Now, within the express industry, as I said, I'm no longer in Express, but DHL is part of the company. But the Global Express Association has proposed a sort of a hybrid model, if you like, on how to tax e-commerce, which I think is quite a sensible approach. Firstly, in terms of the VAT, it bends towards the Australian model, which is making it as simple as possible. There aren't any customs procedures, for example, under the Australian model. The only thing that we have to do, or Express has to do, or any carrier has to do, is transmit the tax identification number of the company that shipped. The rest is dealt with between the seller or the platform on the Australian government. But what the GEA have also said is, if you need to charge customs duties, and that would be above, say, 150 euros in the EU, it's digitalized using APIs. So I'm not a technical guy, but the key thing is they're offering a set of buckets around certain tariff codes, which make it more automated in terms of process. So, our priority is moving and supporting SMEs selling into the EU. Elena, I agree. We need to see more e-commerce globally. The EU is a supporter of the multilateral trade-based system, of the rules-based system of the WTO. We have a major agenda in terms of helping DCs and LDCs, and I think that needs to be part of the discussion going forward. How we refine what's coming from midnight to make it simpler in the long term, and also to learn the lessons of where we're going and how we're going, and implement that. But I think for starters, what will be really, really helpful for us and for SMEs that want to export to the EU is an absolute website listing which member state is where what you can do there. Clearly, it's you know what you can do with Estonia. That's pretty clear. And as Elena said, it's even in English as well. And I've also had a look at some of the websites, and they're not in English. They're in some of them are even in a different script. So that makes it very, very difficult for non-EU traders. But as I say, it's an understandable move, but the big focus needs to be on non-tariff barriers. That needs to become a major priority for us going forward if we're to support SMEs in developed and least developed economies. Thanks.
Stephen, thank you. So, right. So just a quick comment. So Stephen, of course, raises some challenges about this, but leaving that aside, perhaps, we can ask Annegret for a short response, but I would note something beforehand. Stephen introduces an interesting topic with the example of Australia, that viewed from the outside for small businesses, this is a relevant consideration, because some of the small businesses we deal with have to think about a strategy of where they're selling to. And I think, as Elena was mentioning, it could be that Europe's an attractive market. It could be that this ultimately leads to Europe being a more attractive market. But there are reasons why other markets, the very high de minimis still in place in the US or Australia, turn out to be interesting opportunities as well. So that's one of the things, to consider. This technical topic has a strategic elements for many small businesses on the outside of saying, how do I calculate this and what do I do? So we can imagine that there are many questions about this. But I had got a list of questions somewhere, the list of questions from Chris. You sent me a list of questions, didn't you?
Yes, I can read them loud if you want, James.
Right, they disappeared. They were on my screen and it's got buried somewhere. Sorry, it's me that's the dummy. So okay, yeah. There was if you can pick up a couple of the questions that we had.
Yes, there was a question on marketplaces. So the question is, how do marketplaces not based in the European Union, but interested in trading into the European Union, work with intermediaries to meet these obligations from tomorrow?
Anybody feel clued up to ask this? So marketplaces not based in the European Union. Oh.
Hello, thank you for the question. I think that marketplaces not based in the EU would also need an intermediary, but we work with a number of marketplaces, and they all have, let's say, an office, a warehouse or something in the EU. So they are registered somewhere in the EU. And I think the major marketplaces have already this registration, and I'm very happy to hear about this initiative of the e-residency, and which seems to be already a long-standing initiative, and I was completely unaware of it. But of course, I only started a few months ago at the Commission. But I'm very happy to hear about this initiative, which will really facilitate the registration, because I imagine that it might be quite challenging to find an intermediary. As Stephen has said, some of the websites of the member states are not even in English. So yeah, it seems to me a very good model, and I'm glad to hear, and I will check your website afterwards. Of course, I'm my VAT colleagues, I think they know you. I'm from the customs side, so for me it's this is really new. And I'm very happy about this.
There's another question about understanding how much VAT percentage to charge. So that does the IOS help with that in understanding?
No, not really. But I already responded to this question in the chat. There's a website run also by the EU Customs and Tax Authority. And on this, you find really everything about the VAT, about the rates charged in every member state, about the processes and everything. So it's very detailed. And it's available in English. So at least this can help.
Okay, I think there's a question here which might be one for Famke. Easy enough. Will freight cost be factored when calculating the VAT?
Yes, I think, well, it's normally from the transport from the port up to the consumer that the transport costs will be included. That's indeed in the EU. I think that's something to verify, but this is usually in the EU the case.
Annegret.
Yeah, maybe I can chime in here. For the VAT itself, it is not included in this, because for the VAT calculation, it is the sales price, and only, of course, if you have on an invoice all the different aspects that compose the price and the freight costs are in there, it would be, but usually this is not the case. But for customs, it's different. For customs, the sales price, for the customs duty collection, the sales price is included.
Right.
Yeah.
And in fact, this is an opportunity for me to put another plug in for the publication, which works through calculations exactly like this, about when the freight charge is included, how that's taken into account. And of course, it depends which bit of the freight charge, because it'd be the freight charge into the union and then the freight charge intra-union. For those are considered differently in this, about where they're applied to calculate the amount of duties on this. Obviously, the intra-union is not relevant to the costs of duties. Yeah. But there's a few calculations in the publication that give that. Right. Any other burning questions? I suggest what we do, we're at time there for our initial session, so we can let the panelists get on with their day jobs. I'll offer them the opportunity to say a last word, but let's just say it's not over for most of the people who are there. If you like, you can join our shorter session, which starts in just over 10 minutes. And there we can answer, we will revisit some of these topics and we will have a discussion between us. But to begin with, I want to offer the different panelists some closing remarks. Stephen, I think your hand was raised.
Yeah, thanks, James. I just wanted to quickly answer a question for, I think it's Barami. And I think that it's a key one that a number of people will be interested in as well. FTA, free trade agreements. Free trade agreements don't deal with this because this is a consumption tax issue. This is not a customs duty issue. So even if there's an FTA between an EU member state, or we're talking about EPAs, this does not apply. This is a domestic taxation issue. So yeah, you will have to adhere to these rules, even if there's an FTA between your country and the EU, or say, for example, the AU or the AFCFTA in the EU. So shall I finish on the final point then, James? I think the one thing that I would like to add is the caveat is, I think we need going forward, I think this is certainly going to be for us a challenging time, and it will be challenging for the SMEs that we're engaged in, and we'll be working as hard as we can to help them. But I think the one thing that we need to focus on, this is a consumption taxes issue. This is about VAT in the EU. So the customs interaction with business should be kept to the absolute minimum. There has to be a safety and security element. That's always a given. But in terms of the revenue collection, there shouldn't be another process above and beyond the safety and security interaction that the customs have to do, must do. And that would be, I would add, and I would just say, look at Australia. That's exactly what they've done. That's why they have so many businesses that are voluntarily registering, even via the postal stream, which was exempt initially. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. Anybody else want to say a close word? Annika.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I would say that, okay, I know that it's really challenging, and but let's say these ideas that the other speakers had, I'm really I appreciate them. And we are still working on this whole thing. E-commerce is really huge for us. And actually this reform was already prepared a number of years ago, but it takes a while until it is implemented. But we are continuing working on this issue. We are in a very good dialogue with the platforms to see what kind of interaction we can have. We are also evaluating. We are also evaluating our current customs legislation, and this idea that Stephen has mentioned about just focusing on the security and safety and having other procedures for the VAT. We are there. We are working towards this direction also. Yeah, but it will take a while, but we are working on it. Thanks.
Elena, want to say something?
Yeah, just hoping that at least we can offer something to make the SMEs' life easier in this and reduce the burden both on the monetary or the administrative side, hopefully.
You're going to get millions of people moving to Estonia.
No, the e-residency is not about moving to Estonia. E-residency is only about.
Oh, it just sounds too good to keep away from. Okay, great. Thanks. Famke.
Yeah, I just realized also in this session it's really interesting to have the Estonian and the Commission perspective, and having, I'm from the Netherlands. I've worked with different governments as well. And it's really clear that VAT is also a strategic topic for governments. And just as customs duties can't be used as trade instruments because it's really at the outside border. The customs EU, for example, has full competency on that. But VAT still remains an area where governments can actually also influence their own trade competitiveness and, in a sense, compete even within a customs union. This is what we see across the world, in ASEAN as well, in Africa as well. So there's also some hesitation to completely simplify and perhaps transfer these powers to the Commission, which would essentially be most efficient for traders. But
Okay, so thanks everybody. Thanks for this debate. I think it's provoked lots of ideas, lots of interest. Luckily, those who want to have a part B can stay 5 minutes or so. I think we'll have a little break, a little comfort break, and then we'll be back. The game there is, I think we'll go back. Famke can revisit some of these issues that we saw at the beginning and provoke some of the questions, and we can have a discussion between ourselves, okay? To allow you a bit of an extended Q&A. But with that, I close this initial debate. Big thanks to everybody. Very thought-provoking, very interesting. This one will run. We'll come back to it probably. I'm making a little promise here, but in September time, and review some of this, the lessons learned, and offer the real-world experience on it. So watch this space. We'll keep you informed how it goes. Okay. Have a great day, and maybe see some of you in 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, sorry, I have to ask you for the poll. Christina, help me. What poll have you got? There's a poll that you've published.
Yes, we have a very, very short poll. It will take like less than a minute for participants to give feedback on the session. So right. I'm launching it now.
You're going to launch that now? Well, there you can. That would be helpful if you can just give us some opinions. This is important for us to track when we do these things, yes?
Yeah, and of course, I mean, once you do it, connect in 5 minutes and we'll start the next workshop.
So welcome back. Those of you who've stayed, I hope you enjoyed your little break. And what we'll do now, linking up with what we started on. So I'm not sure how many people are new. I think there are very few who were not at the panel debate, but just to be clear, what we've just had is a discussion on the generalities of duties and taxes and why that's important. It's come about different jurisdictions. So for instance, we were looking at the US versus Europe, and Europe has this big change about to happen tomorrow in terms of VAT, in terms of sales taxes. And Stephen from DHL introduced us to Australia as another market with a very interesting de minimis and tax schedule. If you're within the European Union and you're practicing business within the European Union, obviously the business of Australia or the US is not so interesting. But as many of our audience here are outside the European Union, it is interesting to know about different jurisdictions, not only the European Union, but the one that we looked at was the US. And we also, there are some questions that we'll come back to that were in thread earlier on about how duties are calculated and the relationship between that and VAT. So this is somewhat confusing if it's not your business to worry about that. Unfortunately, if you want to do e-commerce internationally, at some point you do have to worry about it, which is all the business of providing good information, providing some training, and hopefully we can contribute to that. So I welcome back Famke, who's going to run us through a little bit these topics. And what we can do is we can welcome some of these questions. Hopefully a lot of them we're going to be able to answer in this session. Ask the questions anyway, even if we can't answer them, because we will collect the questions and go and find the appropriate responses from Annegret and her team if it's about the EU and the new issues with DG Taxud. And within ITC, there's also the basis of a lot of experience in the area of duties and taxes. So I'll pass over to Famke.
Voilà. Can you hear me now? Yeah. Thank you. So after the panel debate, the idea was to actually take our participants and your I think from a very varied background, maybe e-commerce sellers, buyers, perhaps some representatives from even governments or intermediaries, and all welcome. And the idea is indeed to take you through more the nitty-gritty of customs and duties and trade compliance, and reflect some of those findings that we have captured in the guide. Yes, perhaps let's first take this very practical perspective from a trader's side, because in the end our guide has been written with the e-commerce seller in mind, and this overview of building blocks of e-commerce business model is not in the guide, but I thought it was quite useful just to set the scene here that the trade compliance and customs and taxes are actually really running through your entire business, and they are very strategic. They, on the one hand, are really determined by your delivery model. We already mentioned that, and so whether you sell each package from your foreign market to the destination market, or you actually work through warehouses. So the actual trade compliance, customs and taxes will be influenced. But of course, first, the selection of products and services that you want to sell. I think we're typically talking here about products, but services are also important in the sense that VAT will be charged on services as well. The selection of products and services will determine also the rates and also whether duties and taxes need to be paid. So, for example, it starts with product classification. This is really an issue that it's the first step and the first basis of trade compliance, but it's an issue where a lot of traders actually run into trouble, and even our logistic providers such as FedEx or DHL, they often receive very incomplete consignment notes with not the right description, not the right classification code, and this, in a sense, is already a red flag at the customs administration when your goods want to go through the borders. Obviously, target markets, this is also really key because customs and taxes are really market specific. So from your business model, I think it's that is also one of the tips that actually comes out from our guide. Be really conscious about your biggest target markets and where your most of your customers are situated, and make sure that you have this understanding of the key workings of, for example, the indirect tax system for VAT or sales tax or GST, and some of the registration matters. So yes, and in the end, obviously, it will impact upon your cost and your profits. And the profitability. And so if you see here in green at the bottom, it is really advisable to also review the setup of your business and your e-commerce delivery models. Review that on maybe an annual basis as you are growing your business into maturity, to ask yourself these questions. Do I actually have an optimized model from a tax and customs and trade compliance perspective? And obviously then also looking at it more holistically with logistics at the same time, and maybe take some expert advice to take you through some of the alternatives. So in our guide, we've also explored some of those delivery models that are most common, and the options are indeed about threefold, mainly mentioning where is the location of the goods. Do you keep them in your own stock, or do you sell from a warehouse closer to the target market? Or maybe do you even have a registration and a local footprint through a local presence in the target market? Then the other option is indeed trade compliance. Do you actually keep your customs and duties management within your business, meaning that you actually are the person that is completing the commercial invoices, that is calling with the customs administration when there are any issues to be clarified, and take care of the payment of the customs duties, if that is possible? Or do you outsource that to a logistic provider? So then most of the companies that are, well, small, medium-sized enterprises in e-commerce, they actually decide on the option here on the right to outsource trade compliance and to sell and ship from their own stock. I think the advantages are well, that first of all, you have limited risk of non-compliance. And non-compliance, what is the word of compliance? Well, it means that you're not in line with the domestic legal requirements, for example, for registration, for tax filing, for payment of duties. If your logistic provider takes care of these issues for you, it will save you a lot of time and effort, and it saves also potential bad reputation, impact or a delayed, as a result of delays, as a result of fines and penalties that you need to pay when your customs administration at the border finds any incomplete documents or has issues with your shipment. So at the other hand, there are some cost implications. So that the outsourcing of trade compliance is definitely does also come at a price. And there are so many choices or some different choices to take. And I would recommend to definitely research the different packages that are offered through the different providers, for example, UPS, FedEx, DHL. And let's also not forget the postal services that increasingly also offer sometimes guidance in the area of trade compliance. Although that is still it's in its infancy, normally these more advanced services on trade compliance are not available through the postal services. I think using a customs warehouse with all the fulfillment options that are available becomes more and more interesting as companies, they want very quick, or consumers, they want really quick delivery. They also expect perhaps track and trace services. They want to know where their package is. They want to be able to, and it also offers the advantage of, for example, return management. So when e-commerce sellers are typically growing, they may also choose these options of using a warehouse. And we see that, for example, Amazon now has also fulfillment by Amazon with 7 different countries in Europe that are served through those warehouses, and obviously offering advantages as well. But again, additional costs. Right, so looking at trade compliance from a market perspective, what does it actually entail? So the questions that e-commerce sellers really need to know about are what to pay, where and how. And I think it's not only about the payments and the costs, but it's also about registration and fulfilling all the documentary requirements, because these are typically, well, that's typically called the red tape and the bureaucratics around trade. And increasingly, there is a lot of digital systems and registration systems, but still, for example, if you want to register for VAT in the EU through the new import system that was just mentioned by our colleague from the DG Taxud, the VAT registration may also need to be approved by a member state. It may take some time. So these matters need to be taken into account. Also, who pays? Who has the responsibility for the actual payment of the duties and the taxes and the Incoterms? I already mentioned these. We can maybe briefly look at these as well. And the different roles and responsibility throughout the customs process are important to see. Yes, then just to emphasize, we already mentioned that earlier, that the e-commerce specifics in trade compliance are not that, they're not so different from regular trade, although indeed the different thresholds for importing duty and VAT free are quite interesting from an e-commerce perspective. And the fact that the EU, for example, from now onwards does not offer a VAT free option anymore doesn't take away the fact that there are still free customs duties imports below 150 euros in the EU. And for example, in the US below $800. So that's still interesting. And even in Australia, $1,000 or Australian dollars. It's very market specific. Yeah, so let's look a little bit more in depth in the customs process and some of the responsibilities that come with exporting cross-border or trading cross-border. I think it's really relevant for e-sellers to have all the information ready before shipment of your goods. And of course, if you're working with an outsourced model and trade 3PL company, it's more concise information that you need to provide, at least at minimum the classification code, weight, the correct description also of the goods, And a commercial invoice will be prepared often by the logistic providers, but you still need to provide the information online regarding all the description of the goods, for example. So when your goods arrive at the border, I think that's where the role of the logistic provider or the customs broker is increasingly very important. And now here in the EU, the need to work through an intermediary is also a reminder that their role will actually grow. So they will make sure that your document will be transmitted to the customs administration. And here the actual customs administration, customs officers, they come into play because they will assess your goods based on the risk levels for example, illegal trade, for safety, but also they will assess the documents, whether they have all the information that is requested, and the customs duties and VAT are calculated in the right way. Of course, customs administration cannot control and check every package. They will, especially in the e-commerce context, usually do ad hoc checks. Even in the Netherlands, our customs administration only controls and actually inspects maybe 1% of the goods that is coming through the harbors or the airports. But there are countries in the EU and outside the EU that are really exploring ways to go, because that's the fact of illicit trade, and maybe sometimes, for example, packages that are described as containing a very containing a toy, for example, in a sense may contain something completely different. And the case of iPhones being declared as another product and as a value under 22 euros, that allows to import duty-free and VAT-free into the EU is, of course, an issue where customs administrations increasingly want to avoid. After the border, indeed, the need to also keep an eye on the question whether you need to again pay customs duties when your goods are returned or not, and how that works in practice. For example, will your logistic provider take care, or will you need to do that? These are all very crucial matters. Right, so around the Incoterms, just a quick word because they remain really, really relevant. Those are really basically the background, the contractual. They provide the contractual framework for your business relationship between the seller and the buyer in e-commerce. The International Chamber of Commerce has recently, I think even this year, launched a new version of the Incoterms, and they're really standardized terms. And normally the delivery at place Incoterm is standard, and this means that the duties and taxes are unpaid, but I think the seller being responsible for all the payment, such as the DDP model. So where you as a seller will actually need to pay the customs duties and the VAT. It's also still an option that normally you need to choose that option when you are outsourcing your trade to, for example, a logistic provider. But some of the logistic providers only work, for example, with the delivery at place Incoterm. Yeah, as already mentioned, the really growing and important role of the customs broker. And it's good to bear in mind that increasingly governments, they even impose mandatory use of customs brokerage services for all clearance transactions. That also has to do with some need for customs administrations to have additional capacity and perhaps share the burden also in customs management when e-commerce flows are just increasingly growing. And I think here it's really important when you're working with a customs broker that your contractual arrangement is really clear, and this is something you need to review. Also, perhaps ask a lawyer what happens in case of non-compliance, because even your trade compliance services that you pay for, your customs broker can also run into trouble, or sometimes even mistakes. Mistakes are human, so be clear about what is the role of your logistic provider when there are any issues. So, for example, if your package is at the border of a foreign market and the package is broken, or and it can't actually be sent anymore to the client, to the buyer, who will pay for the customs duties and VAT, or do they still need to be paid? Yeah, can the logistic provider be held accountable if it's due to their role or not? I mean, these questions have apparently, or in my experience also, have really caused trouble, and it's very important to be clear on the responsibilities when things go wrong. Yeah, so in the previous session, the panel debate, we already saw that there's just really the trend for governments to fine-tune their customs and taxation regulatory frameworks. So here, indeed, how do they do that? Well, they increasingly use VAT to increase government revenues. More and more countries also outside the EU, the US, Australia, outside the OECD countries, more and more countries, more and more the governments, they develop VAT systems. So that's definitely a way to improve government revenues, and also the low value good thresholds that was already mentioned are taken out, which is a really bad news for the small and medium-sized companies that are, of course, using these exemptions to trade customs and duty and VAT free. I think also automating the registration processes is a very important trend, and that allows to, of course, monitor which traders operate on the market. Right, so here you see an overview of our roadmap that we had prepared, and that's basically is shared through our customs and duties guide on e-commerce, and well, some of the basics of really indeed understanding customs and indirect taxes from a market perspective as well. That's something we discussed. So for customs duties and indirect taxes, the guide actually takes you through some of those specifics, and also gives you the very practical examples how to calculate duty and VAT. I think that the fourth step of communication is increasingly important. So upfront, before selling your services, I think buyers really appreciate when you are very transparent about how you about the customs duties and VAT costs, but also how you deal with returns, for example, and like making sure that, for example, that you have a return policy on your website, and all the information is there. It's very important, transparency regarding your policies and approaches. Let's see the time, because it's 1:45. Perhaps until what time do we have, James? Can I use?
Sure. We'd said until 1 o'clock. So there's another 18 minutes to be precise.
Including questions, or?
Yeah, sure. Right. I mean, we started this session maybe a little bit late, but
yeah. So perhaps just a quick view on the customs duties key steps, because A lot of small businesses, they think, well, I outsource these responsibilities to my logistic provider, and but then when the goods are, for example, held up at the border and logistic provider comes up with questions, for example, regarding the wrong classification or the customs value of the goods, that's typically not something you will have to calculate. But it's important to be aware of the steps and components of calculating customs duties. Also, quite frequently, logistic providers will not be very proactive in using trade agreements, for example. And if you're exporting above the low value goods exemption, it's really interesting to research whether there's a free trade agreement that actually offers a lower tariff, a lower import tariff. Let's see, classification of goods. Well, I really advise that you go on one of ITC's MacMap tools, for example. Yeah, just to rank the different classification codes for your top 10 products, for example, and verify that with your target markets. ITC's MacMap is excellent, but at the same time, you always need to have the market-specific tool on the side, which also gives you the market-specific other type of requirements behind the border requirements. So the EU runs the TARIC website, and the US ITC also has a different tool to search the national tariff line. There we can do a whole different one-day course on customs duties and tariff preferences. So that's a bit much for today. But on free trade agreements, I do think that's an opportunity for e-commerce sellers, but we have to be realistic as well. I mean, 70% of EU businesses do not use free trade agreements. They actually choose to trade under the very general applied tariff, the MFN tariff on the WTO. And why is that? Because there are quite complex rules of origin. Rules of origin are about whether your product was produced with, well, a certain share of domestic materials from the two partner countries, and if it doesn't, you won't qualify for the FTA preferential tariff. So that, in a sense, is a huge trade barrier, and a lot of companies, they actually think, well, spare me the hassle, I will just trade under the applied general rate. But that said, you can be quite proactive and discuss with your logistic provider whether there are possibilities, if you know that there's a trade agreement and you may actually fulfill the conditions. It can save your, you can make a lot of cost savings. Yes, and then with the consumption taxes, VAT, GST, sales tax in the US, there are different types of systems. I think if you're exporting to different markets, you have become acquainted with those different systems. I think the key difference is good to realize. In the EU, the VAT system actually charges VAT for every stage in the supply chain, from manufacturing to reseller to transportation up to the consumer. And in the US, sales tax is actually charged only at the end, so really when the consumer is the end of the supply chain. It's also important that both of the systems, they charge VAT on the import or on the supply chain stage, but then in addition you have periodic VAT payments to make if you as a business meet the registration threshold, meaning, for example, in Germany the registration threshold can be 100,000 a year, this is hypothetically, and in a certain US state where sales tax is administered at state or local level, it can be maybe $10,000. So this is a huge issue, and if you want to be on the safe side, again, use a logistic provider or a customs broker to keep track of your registration threshold to make sure that you actually pay the periodic fees. Well, I think the team from DigiTaxud has already explained pretty clearly the new EU VAT rules. Indeed, in orange you see, yes, there's in principle the registration. What is really clear is with the new EU rules that every business needs to pay import VAT. So there is no more exemption. And this is unfortunate for a lot of businesses that didn't have to deal with VAT. But there's also, it's also important for an e-commerce seller to keep in mind that there are actually two options, and maybe even a third one, that the e-commerce seller, you can register in the iOS system and request for the VAT payment to be done through the system to the government, or you can appoint a customs broker or pay your VAT through the e-commerce platforms such as Amazon or eBay or Shopify. I think this option, and we haven't heard that perspective today, but it's a huge shift in the landscape of customs and duty payment, where part of the responsibility is now shifted on the e-commerce platforms to collect VAT. And I mean, it's also really exciting to see and to hear how that works out in the coming months. I think there's also, I'm pretty sure there's also still a third option. We wasn't able to ask Annegret to verify, but you can still choose that the buyer pays the VAT and the customs clearance fees directly in the EU country of the buyer. So that means that if you use a different Incoterm, but that's something to verify. In the end, it's important to realize that the government collects, the government in the end needs to be paid the VAT in the EU country of the buyer. And of course, the import iOS system is only up to 150 euros. So that is also something to verify when you are selling your goods. And this is just a snapshot taken from the, this is from the presentation of our colleague from the DG Taxud. Yes, just a final three slides. And I think exemptions on payments of customs duties and taxes, they are still relevant. And there are two types of exemptions, those for the customs duties and those for the VAT or the sales tax or other indirect consumption taxes. So in the EU, there's no more VAT exemption. In the US, there was never a VAT or sales tax exemption. So that makes actually, it's quite clear that you can still focus, however, on the customs duty exemption in the Netherlands or in other EU countries. That exemption is for goods below 150 euros. And in the US, it remains below $800 already since 2015. But beware that these amounts may actually still change in the future. And a really good source is the Global Express Association. They keep track of all the different de minimis rates. And yes, this is one of the calculations that we included in our guide. I think it's a bit too much to take you through it entirely, but it takes as a point of departure an exporting company based in Guatemala selling leather bags through its own website and to a customer in Germany. If you see the customer ordered for 650 euros, but the customs value is calculated, and that is, you will be guided in our publication, and so the customs value will amount for up to 700 euros because it includes transport to the port in Germany. And the customer also wants to have an estimate before it purchases. So you as an e-commerce seller, you're actually tasked with making this calculation. And with the 3 bags partly produced in Guatemala, and 50% of the value really represented through the Guatemalan local production process, You will also want to see whether you may qualify for FTA preferences under the existing free trade agreements between the EU and Latin American countries. And so you see that in the end, the estimated total charges on VAT is 19%, so that amounts to 140 euros. And there's additional administrative handling charges that are also actually added to the costs. And this is 2.5%. And this is the customs broker that charges that on customs and the VAT amount. And in the end, 160 euros from the total of 700 euros is represents the customs duties costs. I think on a calculation like this, what we would typically do in a training workshop over maybe 2 or 3 days, I think 2 days which should be fine, is to actually guide our e-commerce sellers first on the customs duties aspect, because it's still a different way of and different thinking, really collected at the border by the customs administration, and VAT is collected at point of sale or really throughout the consumption, the supply chain process. So there are different principles, and I think it's very wise and advisable to understand both different trade instruments, let's say. So some of the practical recommendations from our guide on around trade compliance is indeed make sure that you understand the key aspects of the customs process, duties and taxes. You may also want to do that together with other businesses in your country, and maybe the e-commerce association or just general sector associations may be able to also organize such a capacity building service. Then yes, be really transparent and communicative to your clients and customers about customs and taxes, and definitely rely on third-party logistic providers to help you with that information. Very often they have also good guides on their website increasingly, and obviously you can rely on government information, but I find typically that logistic providers, they have a bit more the trader perspective in their guidelines, and so they're really helpful. They can be useful. Review also your trade compliance performance, like on a 6-monthly or annual basis, maybe 6-monthly. Schedule a talk with your customs broker or logistic provider on what are the incidents that happened, when was non-compliance an issue, and how did that come about, and what can you do more maybe to optimize your trade compliance setup. Fourth, also keeping records of all trade transactions. It's hugely important, because I think in the EU you need to keep records of trade compliance up to 5 years, and customs and administrations and VAT can actually ask about that. Finally, automating part of your trade compliance is really crucial if your business is growing. And of course, there are some tools around, but that's maybe more for research purposes. I'm talking more about internal systems to automate parts of your trade compliance that keeps track of, for example, your sales tax thresholds, and also the VAT thresholds in the EU, and maybe your relations with your customs logistic provider can be covered there as well as with customers. And then finally, be prepared to reconsider your delivery model in light of trade compliance. That's already mentioned. You're working with warehouses with additional fulfillment options, insourced or outsourced trade compliance. And we actually take as point of departure the outsourced trade compliance. And I think that will be, fortunately or unfortunately, the standard model. But at the same time, some businesses still keep their trade compliance in-house, and that's hopefully that should still be able, should still be possible as well. So it shouldn't be too complex for a business to take care of that themselves, but it's challenging, definitely. So I hope that this half an hour, 40 minutes was really trade compliance in a nutshell, and I hope it was useful. Probably it raised more questions than answers, or perhaps, but we refer also to the guide, and perhaps in autumn or later on, we'll be able to organize more similar workshops that respond to some of the issues that arise. Thank you. And if there are any questions, definitely happy to.
Okay, thanks, Franca. Thanks. Right. So a little bit behind schedule, but maybe people can stay with us. There are relatively few questions so far in the chat, like this. There was one about from Southern Africa, and say, how do we go about sourcing an intermediary to assist on receiving the goods into the EU, please? Well, there are different there are different possible answers depending on what you mean. But if you do mean about the one-stop shop and the representative, I heard Annegret offer to send us a list of representatives who are available. So there are professional intermediaries that propose that solution to help you set up the IOS. Now, I heard her say that, and I'll be looking to get that list from her, which we can publish. Yeah.
I also had confirmation from Annegret, right, that regarding the third option, that regarding VAT payment, it is still possible that you get the consumer or the buyer to pay the VAT. So there are three options, right? So that's that slide around VAT. There's the option to go through the IOSS, then there's the option to work with the platform or the customs broker, and still in orange here, there's the option to have the buyer pay VAT. So
what we're seeing though in some of the platforms, we're seeing an initial reaction, and this is probably initial reaction in the time that it takes them to sort this out, is that they're insisting on sellers who are VAT registered, so that it looks like a lot of the platforms are not doing this service of handling the VAT for potential sellers. That may be something that evolves. At the moment, they're selecting their out of Europe suppliers. So that's, not good news if you don't have a VAT registration, or otherwise looked at it's a challenge to get a VAT registration in Europe. So let's just see. Yes, well, the various very general comments from various people who raised the same question: will this be available? Will these presentations be available? Yes, we can make these presentations available. Hopefully you've registered and you've given us your email address in the registration for this, and that will make it easy for us to copy people who've attended. We'll do our best to pick up some emails from the chat, but it's better if you have registered with us.
Yeah.
Tina, did you pick up?
Maybe what I want to also mention, just to really emphasize that you can have third parties to take care of your customs and tax compliance, but ultimately you as a seller will remain responsible. So this is the issue with the contractual arrangement. It really can't be underestimated you can't underestimate the fact that you maintain the final responsibility. And so you need to have this basic understanding and have a good insight in some of your key markets and products and how that translates to customs and taxes. So I just really hope that in most of the emerging economies where a lot of sellers use these e-commerce opportunities and trade into the EU, into China and the US, that there's this effort to actually improve trade and customs and tax knowledge.
Okay, so perhaps there, are there any questions? Says he. So you can either use the chat if there's the possibility in this to put your camera on, put your microphone on, and pose a question. Otherwise, there is the chat. As we say, we picked up some questions from the chats. Or if none of these are possible now, you can send us your questions later.
I see one question, right? In case the consumer, the buyer pays the VAT in the EU, this will mainly need to be done through the logistic partner. Yes, well, for example, if it's the Belgian post that delivers the package to the buyer, and the Incoterm of duty at place, yeah, the buyer is responsible for the payment of the duties and VAT. It can be paid through the Belgian post, for example, and if it's done through a logistic provider, and this logistic provider allows for the model that the buyer is responsible and pays for the customs duties, it will be paid through the logistic provider. Yeah.
So, okay, Christina also reminds you in the chat that you can connect to our network, ecomconnect.org. And there, the purpose of all of that is to share this information, act as a place where you can pose these questions and get answers. So please make use of that, ecomconnect.org. So any more questions? Otherwise, we'll slowly bring this to a close.
Yeah, James, it's Steve. I had one.
Steve, please.
I'll put my camera back on. Yeah, I just wanted to raise one area of caution in terms of the customer relationship for those SMEs on the call. Famke's totally right, but you have to be very, very careful if you ask the consumer to pay the tax, that they're fully aware of what the procedures may well be, and that's organized before. Because if you just say to them, will you pay the VAT? And they say, yeah, no problem. But then you don't go through what the process may be, and that there will be additional charges for them as well. It can ruin your customer experience. I speak from personal experience now. This happened to me with Brexit, with another carrier, and it was a real mess, and I ended up paying huge customs charges that I wasn't aware of. Now I just lived with it. It happened, but yeah, the most important thing is just to bear in mind, if you are doing that you have everything under control at the other end. So if you are going to ask Belgian Post or whoever to do it, that all the steps are in place, because if the customer experience is bad at that end, the chances are they won't come back to your site. So be very, very careful about doing. Yes, you can do it, but make sure that you dot the I's and cross the T's, because
right,
at the end of the day, the customer is king.
Right.
Thanks.
Thank you, Stephen. It's a good general point. We would spend time on that. The whole customer service experience is part of the bigger training that we do. I mean, being able to communicate your promises and keep your promises, and this is a fundamental one. And the damage to you is getting it wrong is several things. Stephen points out poor customer reaction when they get a surprise extra bill at the door for their parcel. It can be worse. If you've done that through a platform and you've managed to do that, the platform may use that as a reason to shut you down, shut your business down. We've got plenty of examples historically with small businesses that have got a good, thriving business, but don't properly look after the customs and duties, and it ends up being a customer service issue. The customers complain to the platform and your business is shut down. So, that's the reason. That's another one of the reasons why this is important, getting it right. And there's a new message. Okay. There you are. So I think that's us for today. I'm sure you have many more questions about this. It is a technical topic. Famke was saying, you know, a 2-day training on this topic, you know, so that may surprise some of you that would be necessary. If you wanted to learn a lot more about it, it would need a bit more of a training. Good place may be the publication that we've got for you, the list, the very helpful list that Anna Gret supplied you of the EU's documentation and some of these presentations that we can share from you. So that's already a good basis of knowledge. We'll see you in Ecom Connect. We'll be back with other events. There's a lot of things happening through Ecom Connect, and there will be in September time Ecom Connect Days, which will come back on this and other themes. So have a great day.
James,
and
just a quick reminder, we'll just share again a small poll so that you
Please.
can fill it in before we are done.
Okay.
Okay.
So please have a quick look at the poll and complete the poll. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for those who answered. And we'll send you all the resources of this workshop. Thanks, Famke, and thanks everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good afternoon, evening, morning.